In the spring of 1944, Adolf Hitler became obsessed with finding one woman. Not a general, not a spy master, but an ordinary seamstress who had done the impossible. She had cracked Nazi invasion plans hidden inside a knitting pattern. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared in history, she vanished without a trace. This is her story. Her name was Margaret Ellis, and 6 months earlier she had been living a quiet life in Manchester, England, working in a textile factory on the outskirts of the city. She was 32 years old, unmarried, and lived alone in a small flat above a bakery. Every morning she walked the same route to work, her fingers permanently stained with dye from the fabric she handled daily. Margaret had worked with textiles since she was 14 years old. She knew patterns the way musicians know notes, the way mathematicians know numbers. She could look at a piece of fabric and tell you not just what pattern it was, but where it had been made, what type of loom had woven it, and sometimes even who had designed it. This gift, this strange talent for seeing patterns within patterns, had made her valuable at the factory. But she had no idea it would make her one of the most important spies in World War II. It started on a cold November morning in 1943. Margaret was sorting through wool shipments when a woman in a dark coat appeared at the factory entrance. The woman didn't look like she belonged there. Her clothes were too expensive, her posture too straight, her eyes too observant. She asked to speak with Margaret Ellis privately. Margaret's supervisor nodded, confused but compliant, and Margaret found herself in a small office she'd never been in before, sitting across from this mysterious stranger. The woman introduced herself only as Miss Atkins. She worked for the government, she said, in a department Margaret had never heard of. They were looking for people with special skills, people who could see what others couldn't, people who understood codes and patterns. Margaret's heart was racing, but she tried to keep her voice steady when she asked what this was about. Miss Atkins leaned forward and said something that would change Margaret's life forever. She said the war wasn't just being fought with guns and bombs. It was being fought with secrets and codes and hidden messages, and they needed people who could find those messages in the most unlikely places. Margaret wanted to know why her. Why a textile worker from Manchester? Miss Atkins smiled slightly and pulled out a piece of fabric from her briefcase. It was a simple embroidered tablecloth with a floral pattern. She asked Margaret what she saw. Margaret studied it for a moment and then began to point out irregularities. The spacing between the flowers wasn't random. The colors followed a sequence. The stitching changed direction in specific places. It wasn't just decoration. It was information. Miss Atkins sat back in her chair, satisfied. She told Margaret that tablecloth had been smuggled out of occupied France. It contained the locations of 3 German ammunition depots. It had taken their best cryptographers 2 weeks to decode it. Margaret had seen it in less than 3 minutes. That's when Miss Atkins asked the question that would define the rest of Margaret's life. She asked if Margaret was willing to serve her country in a way that no one could ever know about. If she was willing to risk everything for a cause that might never acknowledge her sacrifice. If she was brave enough to become invisible. Margaret thought about her small flat and her routine life, and the fact that her brother had died at Dunkirk 3 years earlier. She thought about the fact that every night she heard German bombers flying overhead toward Liverpool and Manchester, and every morning she counted herself lucky to still be alive. She thought about all the things she'd been too afraid to do in her quiet, careful life. And she said yes. 2 weeks later, Margaret found herself on a train heading south toward London, carrying only a small suitcase and a cover story about visiting a sick aunt. She was told to memorize an address in Baker Street and to arrive exactly at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. When she knocked on the unmarked door at precisely 3, she was ushered inside by a severe-looking woman, who checked her papers and led her down a series of hallways to a room where 5 other women sat waiting. None of them looked at each other. None of them spoke. Margaret would learn later that this was their first lesson. Invisibility started with silence. The training was unlike anything Margaret had imagined. They didn't teach her to shoot guns, though she learned that eventually. They didn't teach her to fight, though that came too. First, they taught her to lie. They taught her to create a false identity so complete that she could live inside it without ever slipping. They taught her to spot surveillance, to evade pursuit, to communicate without words. They taught her about codes and ciphers and dead drops and brush passes. But what she discovered next would change everything. During her third week of training, an instructor brought in a collection of items seized from German officers: watches, letters, photographs, and among them, several pieces of needlework, embroidery samples, cross-stitch patterns, and knitting. The instructor explained that enemy operatives sometimes hid messages in everyday objects. Margaret was studying a half-finished knitted scarf when she noticed something odd. The pattern was wrong. Not obviously wrong, but wrong in a way that made her textile-trained eye itch. The knit and purl stitches weren't following any standard pattern she recognized. She stayed late that night, studying the scarf under lamplight in her dormitory room. And that's when she saw it. The knit stitches and purl stitches weren't random. They were deliberate. Knit could be a dot, purl could be a dash. It was Morse code, hidden in plain sight. She brought her discovery to Miss Atkins the next morning. Within hours, she was in a room with 3 senior intelligence officers who made her explain her theory again and again. They gave her more samples. She decoded them all. Letters hidden in embroidery, numbers concealed in cross-stitch, dates woven into tapestries. Margaret had discovered something that British intelligence hadn't fully understood. The Germans weren't just using traditional espionage methods. Their agents, particularly their female agents, were hiding information in needlework. And if the Germans were doing it, that meant Margaret could look for it. By January 1944, Margaret had completed her training and received her assignment. She would be dropped into occupied France into a small town called Beauvais, about 50 miles north of Paris. Her cover story was simple and believable. She was a widow whose husband had been killed in the bombing of Coventry. She had fled to France before the occupation to stay with distant relatives. She was a seamstress by trade and would work as such, establishing herself in the community, watching and listening and reporting back anything of value. But what she had no idea about was that her real mission, the one only Miss Atkins and 2 other people knew about, was far more specific. British intelligence had noticed something strange. Information was leaking from the highest levels of the German command in France. Troop movements, supply schedules, strategic plans. But they couldn't figure out how the information was being transmitted. Margaret's job was to find the source. On a moonless night in February 1944, Margaret parachuted into a field in northern France. She landed hard, twisted her ankle, and spent 20 terrifying minutes gathering her parachute and burying it while convinced every German soldier in France was running toward her. But no one came. She limped to a barn 2 miles away, where a local resistance contact was waiting. He gave her papers, money, ration cards, and a bicycle with a broken basket that looked like it had been used for years. Then he melted back into the darkness, and Margaret was alone in occupied France with a fake identity and a real mission. The first few weeks in Beauvais were the longest of her life. She rented a tiny room above a butcher shop and set up her sewing machine in the corner by the window. She took in mending work, alterations, repairs. She was quiet and polite and unremarkable. She learned the rhythms of the town, who went where and when, which Germans could be bribed and which were fanatically loyal. She attended Mass at the local church because everyone did. She stood in line for rations. She made herself invisible. And she watched. Little did she know that everything was about to change. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. Margaret was delivering an altered dress to a customer, a Madame Rousseau who lived in one of the nicer houses on the edge of town. When Margaret arrived, she found Madame Rousseau hosting a small social gathering. 4 other women sat in the parlor, drinking ersatz coffee and talking in low voices about the difficulties of wartime life. And 3 of them were knitting. Margaret's heart stuttered in her chest, but she kept her face pleasant and neutral. She delivered the dress, accepted her payment, and was about to leave when Madame Rousseau insisted she stay for coffee. It would be rude to refuse, so Margaret sat on the edge of a hard chair and sipped bitter coffee substitute and pretended to listen to gossip about whose garden was producing vegetables and whose son had been sent to work in a German factory. But her eyes kept drifting to the knitting. One of the women, a thin blonde in her 40s, was working on a small blanket in soft blue wool. Her needles clicked steadily, rhythmically. But the pattern she was creating made no sense. It wasn't any traditional design Margaret recognized. The switches between knit and purl seemed random, chaotic. Unless they weren't random at all. Margaret forced herself to look away. She smiled and nodded and made polite conversation. She thanked Madame Rousseau for the coffee and left. But her mind was racing. That night, alone in her room, Margaret sat by her tiny window and tried to reconstruct what she'd seen. The blonde woman had been knitting for perhaps 20 minutes while Margaret was there. She tried to remember the pattern. Knit, knit, purl, purl, knit. She wrote it down on a scrap of paper, converting each stitch to dots and dashes. KKP became ... KPP became ... She worked for hours, her candle burning low, until suddenly the letters began to emerge from the chaos. Panzer. Panzer. As in Panzer Division. As in German tanks. Margaret's hands were shaking. She burned the paper in her candle flame and tried to sleep but couldn't. The next morning, she made contact with her handler through the agreed-upon method. A chalk mark on a specific fence post that meant she needed an emergency meeting. They met 2 days later in the ruins of an old mill outside town. Margaret explained what she'd seen. Her handler, a terse French resistant, who went by the name Claude, was skeptical. Women knitting was the most normal thing in the world. Margaret was seeing patterns that weren't there. But Margaret insisted. She needed to see that knitting again. She needed to watch those women more carefully. She needed to confirm what her instincts were screaming at her. Claude finally agreed to let her pursue it, but warned her that if she was wrong, if she drew attention to herself over nothing, her mission would be over and she'd be extracted. Or worse, abandoned. What happened in the next 48 hours would change the course of the war. Margaret began engineering reasons to visit Madame Rousseau's house. She offered to teach basic embroidery to women in the neighborhood. She volunteered to help repair church vestments. She made herself useful and present and forgettable, and she watched those women knit. The blonde woman's name was Isabelle Durant. She was married to a French businessman who supplied food to the German garrison. Her husband was known as a collaborator, which made Isabelle a pariah in some circles and a pragmatist in others. She attended Madame Rousseau's gatherings twice a week, always on Tuesday and Friday afternoons. And she always brought her knitting. Margaret began to notice the pattern. On Tuesdays, Isabelle would start a new project. She would knit for exactly 2 hours, creating perhaps 20 or 30 rows of stitches. Then she would pack it away in her bag. On Fridays, she would bring out a different project and do the same thing. She never seemed to finish anything. She never wore or displayed what she made. She just knitted, steadily and precisely, for exactly 2 hours, twice a week. Margaret started memorizing the patterns. She would come home and immediately write down everything she could remember, converting stitches to Morse code, trying to decode the messages, and slowly, terrifyingly, she began to understand what she was seeing. These weren't just random bits of information. These were German military communications. Troop movements, supply schedules, ammunition counts, patrol routes. Isabelle Durant was receiving orders from someone high up, in the German command, and she was encoding them into her knitting. But why? Who was she sending them to? Margaret watched more carefully. She noticed that every Sunday morning, Isabelle attended early mass at the church. And every Sunday, she brought a basket covered with a cloth. Margaret had assumed it was food for the church charity. But one Sunday, Margaret positioned herself carefully and watched as Isabelle entered. The church placed her basket near the altar with the other donations, and left. 20 minutes later, an older woman Margaret had never seen before picked up that specific basket and left through the side door. Margaret followed her. The woman walked briskly through the narrow streets of Beauvais, the basket, over her arm, until she reached a small house on the outskirts of town. A house Margaret knew belonged to a German signals officer. Her blood ran cold. This was it. This was the network. Isabelle was receiving encoded orders in her knitting, possibly from someone in Paris or even Berlin. She was decoding them and then re-encoding them into new knitting projects. Those finished pieces were being passed through church charity baskets to a courier. who was delivering them to German intelligence officers in the field. It was brilliant. It was invisible. No one looked twice at women doing needlework. No one questioned church charity baskets. The messages were being passed in plain sight, and no one had noticed until now. Margaret knew she had to get this information back to London immediately. But she also knew she needed proof. She needed one of those knitted pieces. She needed to intercept a message. The truth was far more shocking than anyone had imagined. Margaret began planning. She couldn't simply steal from Isabel, that would raise alarms. She couldn't intercept at the church without being seen. She needed another way. It came to her during another Tuesday afternoon gathering. Madame Rousseau mentioned that her niece was getting married in 2 weeks and she was desperately trying to find someone who could make a decent lace veil. Margaret offered immediately. She would create something beautiful, something that required multiple fittings and visits and reasons to be in that house. Madame Rousseau was delighted. And Margaret now had a legitimate reason to be present during every single one of Isabel's knitting sessions. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret attended 5 gatherings while working on the elaborate lace veil. And she memorized every single stitch Isabel Durant created. She memorized them with the precision of someone who had spent 18 years, working with patterns, with the focus of someone who knew lives depended on it. At night, she would reconstruct the patterns, decode the Morse, and translate the messages. What she found made her hands shake. The Germans were planning a major redeployment of forces. 3 panzer divisions were being moved from their current positions near Calais. They were being repositioned further south, toward Normandy. The messages contained dates, coordinates, unit numbers, ammunition quantities, fuel reserves. This wasn't just intelligence. This was a blueprint of German defensive preparations for the entire northern coast of France. Margaret made contact with Claude again. This time, he didn't dismiss her. This time, he looked at her decoded messages, and his face went pale. He told her to stop. Immediately. She had stumbled onto something too big, too dangerous. She needed to extract now, before she was discovered. But Margaret refused. The messages were still coming. Isabel was still knitting. There was more information to gather. Claude told her she was insane. Margaret told him she was a textile worker from Manchester who had memorized German tank, positions hidden in knitting patterns, and if that wasn't insane already, then nothing was. She kept watching. She kept decoding. But she had no idea that at that exact moment, Adolf Hitler was about to discover that someone had infiltrated his communications network. It happened because of a mistake. A small one, but fatal. One of Isabel's knitted pieces had been intercepted by German counterintelligence, not because they suspected anything, but as part of a routine security sweep. An overzealous Gestapo officer in Paris had decided that all communications in and out of certain areas needed to be examined, including things that seemed harmless. The knitted blanket section sat on a desk for 3 days before anyone looked at it closely. And when they did, someone noticed the same thing Margaret had noticed. The pattern was wrong. An interrogation began. The courier broke first. She was just an old woman trying to survive. She hadn't even known what she was carrying. She gave them Isabel Durant's name within hours. Isabel lasted longer. 3 days of questioning before she finally admitted that yes, she was passing messages. But she claimed she was working for the French resistance, that she was feeding false information to the Germans that she was a patriot. They didn't believe her. They tortured her until she told them everything. About the codes, about the knitting, about how the system worked, and about one other crucial detail. She told them that for the past 3 weeks, there had been a seamstress who was always present during her knitting sessions. A quiet woman who watched everything. A woman named Margaret Ellis. Hitler received the report on April 15, 1944. He was at his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, surrounded by maps and reports and the grinding machinery of a war that was slowly turning against him. When he read about the knitting codes, about the seamstress, about the possibility that months of carefully laid plans had been compromised, he flew into one of his legendary rages. Officers who were present later described him as paranoid, obsessive, convinced that spies were everywhere, hidden in the most mundane aspects of daily life. If someone could hide messages in knitting, what else was being used? What other invisible networks existed? He ordered a massive investigation. Every woman who did needlework in occupied France was now suspect. Every piece of embroidery, every knitted garment, every sewn quilt was to be examined. The Gestapo was to find this Margaret Ellis and extract every piece of information she had before executing her as a spy. What they didn't know was that Margaret had already heard the whispers. In a town like Beauvais, you didn't keep secrets for long. Someone had been arrested. Someone had talked. Names were being mentioned. Margaret had perhaps 24 hours before they came for her. She burned everything. Her notes, her codes, her false papers. She kept only what she could carry in her pockets. She made contact with Claude one final time. He told her an extraction had been arranged for 3 nights from now. A Lysander aircraft would pick her up from a field 20 miles away. All she had to do was stay hidden and stay alive until then. But Margaret knew 3 days was too long. They would find her before then. She had to disappear now. That night, she left her room above the butcher shop and vanished into the French countryside. She had some money, some stolen identity papers, and an intimate knowledge of patterns and how to break them. The Germans were looking for a seamstress, a woman alone, someone who matched her description. So Margaret became someone else. She cut her hair short. She stole men's clothes from a washing line. She covered her hands in dirt and walked like a farmer. She moved only at night, hiding in barns and forests during the day. She trusted no one. For 3 days she moved across the landscape like a ghost, evading German patrols, avoiding checkpoints, heading toward the rendezvous point. On the 3rd night, she crouched in a ditch at the edge of a dark field, watching the sky. At exactly midnight, she heard the sound of an aircraft engine. The Lysander came in low and fast, barely touching the ground. Margaret ran from her hiding place, her legs burning, her lungs screaming. Hands reached down and pulled her into the aircraft. The plane was already lifting off as she collapsed onto the metal floor, gasping. She had made it. She was going home. But the story doesn't end there. When Margaret arrived back in England, she was debriefed for 3 days straight. She told them everything about Isabelle Durant, about the knitting codes, about the intelligence she'd gathered. The information she provided helped confirm what Allied intelligence had already begun to suspect, that the Germans were not concentrating their forces at Calais as they wanted everyone to believe. They were reinforcing Normandy. Margaret's decoded messages became one small piece of the massive intelligence puzzle that would make D-Day possible. Her information helped planners understand German defensive positions, helped them target their airborne drops, helped them know where the weak points were. The invasion of Normandy, the largest amphibious assault in history, succeeded partly because a textile worker from Manchester had noticed that a knitting pattern was wrong. But here's where the mystery deepens. After her debriefing, Margaret Ellis disappeared from all official records. There's no record of her receiving a medal or commendation, no record of her returning to Manchester, no record of her ever working for the Special Operations Executive. It's as if she never existed. There are 3 theories about what happened to Margaret Ellis, and the truth is that no one knows which one is correct. The first theory is that she was given a new identity and a new life as a reward for her service. This was common practice for SOE agents whose covers had been completely blown. The British government would create entirely new identities for them, new papers, new histories, new lives in new places. Perhaps Margaret became someone else and lived quietly in some small town until she died of old age, her secrets buried with her. The second theory is darker. Some researchers believe that Margaret knew too much. She had seen how the knitting codes worked. She had seen how British intelligence operated. She had names and faces and methods. In the paranoid world of post-war intelligence, some believe she was deemed a security risk. Perhaps she didn't vanish voluntarily. Perhaps she was made to vanish. The third theory is the one that Miss Atkins herself hinted at years later, in a rare interview before her death. She suggested that Margaret Ellis simply chose to disappear, that after everything she'd been through, after the fear and the lies, and the constant danger, she couldn't go back to being ordinary. Some people, Miss Atkins said, are changed so fundamentally by war that they can never fit back into normal life. Perhaps Margaret walked away from everything and everyone she'd ever known and started over somewhere no one would ever find her. We may never know the truth. What we do know is this. In the spring of 1944, Adolf Hitler became genuinely paranoid about domestic espionage in a way he hadn't been before. He began to distrust his own intelligence services. He questioned reports. He saw conspiracies everywhere. Some military historians believe that this paranoia, this erosion of trust in his own information networks, contributed to some of the catastrophic decisions he made in the months following D-Day. And we know that on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the German defenders were not positioned where Hitler had expected them to be most needed. Some had been moved, redeployed, sent to reinforce positions that Allied intelligence already knew about. Allied intelligence that had been gathered in part from knitting patterns decoded by a seamstress from Manchester. Margaret Ellis became a ghost, but her impact on history was real. Today, when you visit the Special Operations Executive Memorial in London, there are 104 names listed of agents who died in service. Margaret Ellis is not among them. When you visit the various museums and memorials dedicated to the codebreakers of World War II, you'll see names like Alan Turing and Joan Clark and Dilly Knox. You won't see Margaret Ellis. There are no photographs of her that we know of. No letters or diaries survived. No family members have come forward with stories. She is one of history's unknown soldiers, one of the thousands of men and women who did extraordinary things in terrible times and then simply vanished into the mist of history. But every time you see someone knitting, every time you notice a pattern in fabric or embroidery or any kind of needlework, remember that during World War II, those innocent domestic activities were sometimes used to hide the most vital secrets. Remember that some of the most important intelligence of the war came not from dramatic parachute drops or daring escapes, but from someone who was patient enough and skilled enough to notice that a knitting pattern was wrong. Remember that history is full of unsung heroes whose names we'll never know. Stories like Margaret Ellis remind us that heroism doesn't always come with medals and monuments. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a textile worker from Manchester, who saw what no one else could see, who risked everything for a cause that would never acknowledge her sacrifice, and who then stepped back into the shadows as if she'd never existed at all. The knitting codes were never used again after Isabel Durant's network was exposed. The method was too compromised. But for a brief window in 1944, it was one of the most effective intelligence networks operating in occupied France. And it was broken by someone who understood that patterns always tell a story, if you know how to read them. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, leave a comment telling me what you think really happened to her. Did she live out her days in peaceful anonymity? Was she silenced by the very government she served? Or did she simply choose to disappear because she could never go back to being ordinary? And if you want to hear more forgotten stories from World War II, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one.